I wanted to indulge into one of my constant rabbit holes. So happy to have all of you kind of be a part of this. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what it really means to be truly sovereign across a number of different dimensions. And I think as Bitcoiners, that's a conversation that people just have naturally, right? Or that they think about naturally. So we want to start with, sovereignty is usually defined as wrestling with the state. What does Bitcoin do? One of the things that Bitcoin does is it separates state from money. That is an important and critical distinction because it hasn't necessarily been done before. So when we think about sovereignty, when we think about how we deal with this behemoth, which is the state, obviously we have decided that the state is a way to organize ourselves. And, there's less violence, there's more war, but there's less killings, there's a monopoly of violence, and all these other elements. But thinkers throughout history have thought about this thread, and Satoshi is kind of a culminating point onto some of this thread of thinking. So I'm going to introduce some of the thinkers that have been wrestling with this before we had Bitcoin, before we had computers, even before we had Esperanto, which if any of you know about that, Esperanto, fun times. So we have Camus and Sartre. I love to introduce the two because Sartre was kind of the perfect exposition of justice and freedom can be combined together. He was a French philosopher. His wife was actually Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Second Sex, famous feminist author. And Sartre really believed in Maoism and communism. He believed that freedom and justice could be the same thing using totalitarian rule. Whereas Camus actually believed, on the right, that freedom was better than justice, that freedom allowed all individuals to be able to reason through and be able to understand where they stood to develop their perspective. It's almost like, does the outcome justify the ends? And to people who are looking at justice, they believe that the outcome does justify the means. But for those who are looking for freedom, they think that the means are part of the journey. Whoops. Well. All right, cool. Seb just presented about Mao Zedong and Huang, who was the first emperor, so why don't I just throw that up there as well. I do not sun my balls, but maybe I should start. So for those of you who don't know the first emperor, you probably know the terracotta warriors that are associated with him instead. This is just to show that, I brought together an example of Camus and Sartre, this idea of justice versus freedom. But this has been a thread of thinking that has gone on for decades, millennia. And so the first emperor, one of the things that he actually did, and the reason why he buried so many scholars, the 460 that were mentioned earlier, is because he believed in this system called legalism. And this system in legalism in Chinese philosophy is this idea that the outcome justifies the means, that the state is able to rule because that is what is right for most people, that most people will see more prosperity and stability with a strong state, even if the state decides every once in a while to bury and burn books, burying 460 scholars alive. In our most modern example, I don't know if anybody actually knows these two individuals, I'm just flashing this out, but probably the modern dialogue that we have around us is really shaped on this between John Rawls and Robert Nozick. And Rawls wrote a book which basically described his form of justice, which looks very, very close to liberal democracy as we recognize today. Rawls is the philosopher of this idea of an egalitarian principle of justice, that there are some freedoms, but that redistributional justice, the ability to be able to give people equal footing to live similar lives, even if they came from different places. Rawls was famous for having the veil of ignorance, right? If you did not know anything about how the world was structured and you could choose to be born in a world, what kind of a world would you choose to be born in? And for Rawls, that answer was a world where people and governments and organizations were set up to ensure that you had equality of opportunity. Nozick, on the other hand, although towards his later years kind of went around this, wrote a book called Utopia. I always miss what's it? Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It's actually quite important what orders they are. And he is kind of the general libertarian philosopher, someone who has talked about freedom in that stance. And the way he's conceptualized it is that we had anarchy. We don't want to go back all the way to like there is no state, because we have lived that life before, and it is not necessarily a great one. If you want to ask I love the paleo diet ideas and stuff like that, but people died pretty early. Like your life expectancy was 30 years. Like it was a little brutal. So that's what anarchy is. And then Nozick goes in and says like, here's how the state emerged, right? I'm not gonna say the whole book to you guys, but basically at the end he's kind of saying like there's a utopia. And what Nozick did stick to, at least throughout his early threads of his life, was really the idea that people should be allowed to derive their own freedom. There should be a minimal state, a state only responsible for a monopoly of violence to ensure that people weren't killing one another or robbing each other or things like that. But in all other respects, he was kind of like the anti-Rawls, right? And in that sense, Rawls has always been someone who has said that there needs to be a strong state to redistribute. And Nozick has said that we can have freedom, people can figure it out themselves. And so this is the kind of debate that was more the political side. I think as Bitcoiners, people are probably more familiar with like the economic side. Obviously, I'm just going to go print out like the Hayek quote about how there's probably going to be a sneaky way for money to come about that's outside of government control, but we're going to have to probably sneak around it. That's kind of the classic. I'm not going to harp too much about Austrian economics versus New Keynesian, except to say that I went to school in economics, so that's part of the reason why this is part of my rabbit hole. But of course, this is also a part of this discussion of how do we think about being more sovereign. So we were thinking about what kind of state do we want to live in? What kind of a state is right for all of us? And now it's kind of thinking, well, what kind of economics do we want? What kind of a money do we want, right? And of course, I just put Paul Krugman up. For those of you who don't know, Paul Krugman, New York Times columnist, probably the most representative person when I say a New Keynesian. And I just put this up here because I thought it was a funny quote. But basically, in the Keynesian school of economics, there is, in my opinion, a misunderstanding of what creates technological innovation and an inability to see certain things beyond just the numbers and framing. And so in this case, I mean, obviously we have Krugman saying that, and this is, by the way, from a 1998 article. This isn't like from a 1980 or whatever. This is like fairly developed, right? And we laugh and we giggle, but really the way to think about this is what kind of an economics do we want as well? If we're thinking about this journey about how to become truly sovereign, I know this has been very abstract, by the way, y'all. Like, I'm going to get like more specific and give like specific pointers and things that I also think about. But it's also important just to think about what kind of political and economic systems we live in, and whether or not we have choice or agency in that matter. So now we're getting closer a little bit to like familiar territory. Of course, all of you, or I would assume many of you, are familiar with the cypherpunks, who were originally kind of that part of genesis pool of the Bitcoin community. For those of you who don't know, the cypherpunks were a bunch of coders who were in the 90s looking to preserve privacy. They were really actually working with email and trying to find ways for people to email each other privately, or to feel out ways that you could send emails and it couldn't be traced. A lot of those innovations are actually some of the foundational layers behind how we think about Bitcoin. Just like how the cypherpunks thought about spreading information in a way that could be, obviously accessible, but still private, who that might come from. We also have taken some of those tenets, of course, into Bitcoin. And then, we have Satoshi. And I think one of the things about Bitcoin that I always felt like was the most one of the more underexplored topics in terms of how Bitcoin fits into the whole sovereignty stack is that Bitcoin is truly the most scaled solution where it's embraced by millions of people around the world, that is independent of a country. It's not actually the first example of a technology or an approach that might be that. I made a reference to Esperanto before. For those of you who don't know, that was kind of like an attempt to create a language that was independent of the state, where you could communicate with other people, intended to be anarchists at the beginning. So of course this idea of having these technological approaches to communicate information with each other, independent of a state having to certify or stamp it, has always kind of existed, and there have been multiple attempts. I think Bitcoin does this with money, which I think is so powerful, because even now when I talk with people on the street or anything about Bitcoin, people assume that money is kind of a construction of the government, that you get money because you're deigned and you're given the privilege of accessing, government power and government fiat. And I believe that Bitcoin and all the systems within it, and especially if we use it the right way, is one of those protections as part of a broader stack of tools that we can think about how to become more and more sovereign. So yeah, we got really like super abstract. I was talking about like not sunning my balls, like Huang, Mao Zedong, Camus, South. Like, if you guys forget all the names, that's fine too. The important point is that there's always been this dialogue between freedom and justice, politically and economically, and Bitcoin is an important part of that journey. But not the only part, but also not only just the state, right? We can also think of influence from, your boss, your community, your family, your culture. It is important to think about sovereignty, and not just in the sense of like, how do we balance ourselves with the nation state? How do we also think about that in the vein of, any kind of influencing factor that we can think of? And most importantly, I think actually for our age, although ironically I'm delivering this from like an Apple laptop, which is not my normal laptop, but in any case, we are actually living in a very unique era where technology platforms, and not protocols like Bitcoin, right? Protocols being run by independent nodes collaborating together. This, we're talking about human actors coming together, working with the state in many different ways, to surveil and to be able to expand control and access of the state throughout our lives. And not only that, provide an economic tax base for them as well. So it's important to consider, these large tech companies and just how much of a hold they have in our lives. If you want to just take like a second or 2 seconds and just think about like how many times you touch products or interfaces from these 5 companies, right? Yeah, just take a thought. Think about that. Let it sink a little bit. But now we're trying to get into, okay, this is kind of like the tableau. This is like a little bit of this preamble for how to, become sovereign. You had to go through like 15 minutes of me ranting about abstract philosophical ideas. Like, Roger, what's the like actual substance? Like, how do I become more sovereign? I came here to think about that a little bit more. And one of the things that I always tell people is that Bitcoin is part of the solution to me, but not wholly the whole part. And I know like in this community, we sometimes talk about Nostr, we talk about other things too. So by no means is it just within Bitcoin. But it's important, I think, to evaluate Bitcoin as a tool and an approach and a way to spark these conversations in a way that also encompasses these broader elements. To me, one of the most important things to think about is economic agency. And what that means is your ability to earn a livelihood. I have never seen a more crazy era where I think half of the people, if I polled half of you, you would think that maybe your jobs would be replaced by robots or AI or something within the next like 5 years, right? And some people are perfectly all right with that. And hats off to them and all that other stuff. There's this idea of there's a universal basic income, that's gonna help spread it around the world. But using my kernels of Chinese history again, there was a famous dissident in China. His name is Liu Xiaobo, and his story is long and complicated. But the short of it was that he was very perceptive, and one of the things he said was, if the Chinese government controlled my rice bowls like they did during the famine in the 1950s, during the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s, I would not be able to write as frequently and as freely as I could. right? And I think that's just such a powerful idea to think through. Like, our ability to be economic, to have economic agency, is what allows us to be able to flit through different systems, right? Even let's say, supposing there was a war somewhere or something, we've already seen Bitcoin help with this, from Afghanistan to Ukraine or other places. People can just port their savings and interlock it from one system to another, and that's only really possible if you live in a era where you have tools that can help you become more stateless. I just kind of threw up Bitcoiner jobs because that to me is kind of the anti-UBI. I am actually writing a book about this, but I still haven't developed my strong opinion about whether or not AI is going to eat our brains or replace all our jobs or everything within the next 6 years. But I think it's just so important to think about like how you can maintain your independent economic agency regardless of the different settings that you're in. And I recommend Bitcoiner jobs, by the way. It's how I found employment at Block Awards, woohoo. And so this is like a cachet of jobs that most of them tend to be remote. You're getting paid for creating value, you're working for great companies, and you're oftentimes getting paid in sats, which is also really cool. For those of you who don't know about flag theory, we're not gonna go into like 100%, but I did want to introduce a concept to you all because in line with what I just talked about with economic agency, to become truly sovereign, I think you'd have to at least understand. Now, everybody's going to have their trade-offs. Like, I'm not recommending everybody just like go live in a hut on the sea in the international waters, or to like embark into Lapland in Finland, which is visa-free, but also like negative 50 degrees at all times. I'm not saying you need to do that right away. I'm not saying that's a decision you need to make. But what I'm trying to do with this presentation is really just give you all like tools and frameworks and how other people describe elements of this stack of sovereignty. So flag theory is a pretty popular concept. I think a lot of Bitcoiners are probably vaguely familiar with it. Of course, there's second citizenships and second residencies. The short of it is that, in the world that we have, there's a pretty powerful book which is essentially named Voice, Vote, and Exit. And in any system that we're in, any political system that we're in, of course we can choose to vote, we can choose to change things, we can choose voice, we can choose to, voice our opinions, we can choose to protest if there isn't a vote, and the other option is we can choose to leave. Again, I'm not trying to be prescriptive, telling you to go to Lapland right away. That's how you become truly sovereign today. But just so you're aware, these are kind of some of the considerations that you might want to think about. Is there the possibility of getting like another citizenship and residency? Because these are going to become increasingly difficult or more difficult to get. So for example, a lot of the most popular programs, Lisbon in Portugal, they used to have a 250,000 euro program. That's now a 500,000 euro program, right? And that's increasingly, I think, going to be the case. There's the idea of offshore companies, offshore banking, if you want to have your pass-through corp, or other things related to that. Digital assets, I mean, Bitcoin will fit into that because you can transfer through any border, right, without them checking in, seeing if you have $10,000 worth of gold or commodities or anything else in there. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but just as we enter this world where we're able to flit through these different systems, your digital security and I brought some props for that actually, and your operational security and just how you think about your physical security are going to be important as well. Of course, with financial freedom, I just randomly decided to put a photo of a Bitcoin node, but I do strongly suggest, of course, I am speaking to a crowd of mostly Bitcoiners, I'm assuming, at this unconference, but even if you're not, I generally just think that the best solution is to run your own node. I know it's like a harder thing to do than once said, but that's kind of like an ideal. I think one of the things that's kind of really cool, and we saw that in Ben's presentation as well, sovereignty is kind of like a scale, and we're kind of going towards it, incrementing towards it. We can always take more steps or less. But that's something that I admire about the Bitcoin community is we're always thinking about these trade-offs. To me, the best trade-off is, of course, you're running your own node. Maybe on your own hardware or even on a cloud provider. We have some resources for that later on. But that is something that is very important because in order to really be sovereign in the Bitcoin sense of your keys, your money, your ability to do all these things, to be able to flit through these different borders, you do have to have self-custody of your own assets. I also have been a pretty big fan of Nostr. Been doing a lot of writing about that, and I think that for me, one of the most important things is that you should be able to speak. We were just talking about the large technology companies and their impact on our lives, and the thing is that not only do they change kind of what we see through algorithms that are designed to make money off of us, but also they surveil and kind of control and are less privacy. Some of them try to be more privacy tending, but there tends to be different flaws. Like, for example, some of you might have heard of WhatsApp. Of course, WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted for the conversations, but it is not end-to-end encrypted for the metadata. And so Meta, which owns WhatsApp, will pick out. I've actually ran this experiment where I have like pinged random people on only certain channels and see if they show up in my Meta friends suggested list. And you know, people do all these kind of experiments. Like they'll look at like what ads they're being targeted if they have the Messenger app on, and see if like Facebook is, you know, collecting audio and things like that. But just something important to think about, that Damus and Nostr, I mean, I'm not saying Damus specifically, but any client, but Nostr specifically is a really important tool, not only for our ability to be able to communicate freely and not be censored by a company that's beholden to any of these states, but also our ability to be able to actually, you know, communicate freely and clearly without that influence, and not to be surveilled or controlled. So, I mean, this ended up being more dramatic than I thought it would be. But basically, I think like one of the big things to think about as we're thinking through these discussion points is just how can you build your own stuff? Like how can you, to me, like and I struggle with this every day. I'm not saying like I'm coming to you with like the top of the mount sovereign and like trying to pass this down. Like I very much think of a lot of the decisions I make as flawed and all these other things, the trade-offs. But one of the things I try to do is try to get all the way through the root causes. And it's kind of like a ridiculous example, but I almost think of cooking, right? Like you could go to a restaurant and have them cook the food for you. You could get it delivered through Uber Eats, and that's totally fine. I'm not judging you if you're doing that. But that's kind of like the equivalent of taking all the level back of like, I'm going to just literally go, you know, on this wallet that's not self-custodial or anything else, right? Of course, these things are harder, and I think it's a challenge, but something that, you know, the people building tools, if they think about people's user experience, I think that's really important to incorporate. But, you know, it's oftentimes worth it in the long run. It can be a little bit hard. Sometimes I think of myself, I'm like, hey, am I just being like this paranoid freak that like I don't really know any of the trade-offs of this, right? But I do believe that as like a practice, if you just go all the way through the root causes, so to use, again, that cooking example, all the way back, if you're cooking your own food, if you're controlling your own ingredients, if you're, you know, even growing your own food or foraging your own food, if you go all the way down, again, I'm not encouraging you to today become a Bitcoin Knots or core developer, whatever you decide in that debate. But to be aware of that kind of spectrum is so important to me. And I'm always going to lean on the side of like building and being able to build your own stuff. You know, we're going to talk a little bit. I mean, I don't even know if I have enough time, but I probably don't. But just a couple of like operational security, digital security stuff. If I had like 20 seconds to like just chill, this is kind of a little bit more LARPing, but this is a Faraday bag, so it will actually prevent your phone from sending electromagnetic rays to your balls, among other things. Among other things. But if you put this around your devices, it will, you know, I've also seen other people put it in the fridge and things like that, but you know, it is cool to kind of think of, you know, these different tools that we can use that don't require you to like throw your phone off the next cliff, right? Like you can have some utility while really prioritizing your choices and your privacy. And then one thing, if I wanted to sum up everything that I think about digital security or have thought about digital security, I just encourage you all to get a hardware security key. This has saved my life many times. If you have questions, there's like these companies, YubiKey and This one's a Google Titan, which I'm not a big fan of, but Google actually sent this to me because they emailed me and said like they thought I was getting phished or something. So hats off to them for that. But there are other, kind of tool providers as well. Cool. To sum up, you can choose your own governments. You can run your own nodes. You can speak through your own keys. You can secure your digital assets, your digital sovereignty. You can measure your influence and share what you're learning. You can be part of a larger dialogue, and you can be part of communities, just like we are today. Yeah. And we got some resources. So in case people had some resources that they wanted to consult. Nice. Yeah, Leo's in the room, so Leo built Node Academy. So if you want to build if you can always do it in a Start 9 and Umbrel. I'm not saying like don't do that, but if you wanted to like actually go in there and like play around with console commands and feel like a 1980s hacker, like Node Academy is sweet for that. Privacy tools, the guy's a little bit of a Monero guy, which is a little annoying, but that is a really good way to think about all the spectrum of like tools you could be using to preserve your own privacy. It is quite comprehensive in the sense of like the guy has thought through like trade-offs for email, VPN, all the different tools that you could be using. Nostr.how is kind of like my go-to resource if you haven't started on Nostr, which is kind of like that independent network that we're talking about. I actually use the Hacker News for like operational security and defense security. I'm on their newsletter. There's actually also this resource called haveibeenpwned.com, which has also been kind of cool. Have I been pwned? I wish I kind of put this on here, but have I been pwned? You can just kind of put in your emails, and you can see like what credentials you've leaked, if any. Hopefully none, but knowing, I mean, honestly, on average, like you will have leaked 6 or 7, and maybe not realized. But the Hacker News is actually really interesting because they have a newsletter, and it'll actually go through like each vulnerability as they come in. And then I just also shilling Stacker News because, in terms of community, I like Stacker News. I actually think Stacker News has the most comprehensive resources on people who are trying to use Lightning and Bitcoin in a self-sovereign way. It can be a little scary at times, but it's worth it at the end. Okay, this is who I am. So yes, and then I don't know if anybody has any questions, but this is who I am. Yes, guy in the back. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I'm like very underqualified to answer that question. But here's my take on that. Like, I think what's important to recognize is distinction between restrictions on the government that are ought to or ought not to, and cannot. There's a critical distinction because, for example, with end-to-end encryption, it's not a matter of who is in power or who is in the law, or they just do not have the ability to be able to do that particular thing. So for example, if the United States could pass 1 million laws and it would not affect, how Bitcoin's distribution schedule works, right? With end-to-end encryption, same thing. Like, you could pass 1 million laws, but you're not going to, unless one of the ends is compromised, but you're not going to be able to actually break that encryption, right? So I think about that distinction a lot. So to answer your question, I think if you, no matter the strongest degree, because you basically gave like the strongest degree of what we think of like an ought not, should not distinction would be. What if a government we fairly trust, I mean, I don't, but let's say we fairly trust the United States in this case, implemented it in its founding document that it was going to give UBI in certain circumstances and it was not going to punish people and reward people with it. At the end of the day, that can still be reversed or changed, and the Constitution has gone through 26 amendments or whatever number of amendments it's been. I mean, obviously, so there is always that ability to be able to navigate through that. So my preference is always for solutions that don't allow the state to technically do certain things, and that in this case would include end-to-end encryption, Bitcoin and other things. Oh, speaking about end-to-end encryption and other stuff, if you guys really want to go in the rabbit hole, like there's, for every tool that you're using, there is like an alternative that is encrypted or not private companies. So for example, Zoom, Jitsi, Element, Slack, all these other things. I used to run a company that provided like, it was like the dumbest company ever because we made like no money, but like basically we did we did the hardest thing possible for the least amount of money. We were like trying to provide like human rights non-for-profits, like secure kind of like chat as well as video chat for their webinars. And we were charging them like $5 a month or something ridiculously low because we're like, oh, they're like charities. And then these people were getting attacked by like the Saudi state or like these like really big states, like, and it was on our infrastructure, which is a little wild. But I am proud to report that Jitsi was still able to, even though the Saudi government or agents unknown of other governments tried to take down that webinar, it was not taken down. Although we had to pay a lot of money for that to happen. So that was probably not great from like a business standpoint. Cool. All right, any more questions? I don't even know if I answered the UBI question, but yes, you.
Just a quick one. I get this from people all the time. They say, if I say stuff about privacy,
Yeah.
they always say, I've got nothing to hide.
Uh-huh.
What's the best answer just to get them to shut up?
Yeah. I don't, you know, it's a classic dilemma of this thing. Yeah. I'm stalling because I'm trying to figure that out myself right now. But here's like two ways you could approach it, right? Like one way is to like berate people over the head with history. Your mileage will vary, but you might hit an example that actually strikes with that particular person. So one example I actually use pretty often is that how long do you think it took for Hitler to take over Austria and freeze all the bank accounts of all the Jews? How long do you think it actually took? It was like 15 hours. And it was unannounced. It was unannounced. Like literally, they thought they were gonna have a referendum, and the next day the troops walked in, and then they took over. And obviously that's an extreme example. Again, your mileage will vary exactly what examples you choose. But that kind of comes back to that same point of like governance structures change. Things that are regarded as right or wrong now, I mean, that will also change, you know? One thing to think about in this discussion is that eventually all the things that we're saying in an encrypted fashion are going to be broken at some point. But for now, it's like, you know, the encryption and privacy that we choose can choose how we reveal ourselves to the world and the consequences that come with that. And for people who say kind of what you're saying, like, oh, like, I don't have anything to hide, it's because they don't feel like they're doing anything wrong in their system. Sometimes it can help to be like, well, the system changes and stuff like that. But if they're really like, no, I'm in this box and like the world will never change around me and all that stuff, that's like a harder thing to convince them of. A second approach, I think, is I think even if you don't think you have anything to hide, in general, there are people that have things that, you know, again, like using like shifting kind of like standard and things like that. Like there's definitely people that you know that would crave this privacy. If you don't actually participate in that, that's totally fine from like an individual level. But you should be aware that this is kind of like it's like a prisoner's dilemma kind of thing. It's like if you're not doing this, the cost of, you know, surveilling the whole population kind of goes down. And so in theory, you're kind of accelerating dystopia, like in the sense of like, if you don't care and then everybody around you doesn't care and you're kind of like propagating that you don't care, well, then it's just easier and easier and easier and easier and easier for someone to just surveil and target everyone, right? So that, depending on if that person has people they care about other than themselves, I think that might be good. But one example I use quite often, because sometimes I see, like what I try to do a little bit is like kind of discern where they're coming from. And oftentimes I can maybe infer kind of where they're leaning. And there's always an example that can kind of hit them straight there. So one thing I noticed is, for example, like for left-leaning Americans who are like, oh, like I don't have anything to hide and I don't have privacy. Yeah, but then you just bring up like, you know, if you're in a certain state and you send abortion pills to that state, that's a felony. That is, you know, like you might not think that's right or wrong or whatever. You probably have a certain set of beliefs about that. I don't really necessarily care what they are. But my point is that like, you know, those standards can kind of change. I think it's sometimes about choosing like the right example and inferring where they're coming from. Because you'll quickly realize that everybody has, at least if it's not them, people around their immediate circle, you know, have things that they would like to selectively hide and reveal. Hopefully that was helpful. Yeah, that was a lot snappier. Dude, that's great. I can't, yeah. Wait, I think originally you just wanted a one-liner, right? Yeah, that's probably, well, I mean, you get him to shut up because you just literally rant at him for 20 minutes, and then that's kind of, that's kind of like one way to do it. Cool. Any other questions, or I don't want to, yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. I learned how to code Python. So I built like it's not necessarily privacy tools. At one point, I built a company that was like I mentioned, the world's worst company because we were deploying privacy tools for not-for-profit. So yeah, I did. I just I would encourage people to like go like that route down, even or just even being aware that that exists. Right? It's like obviously you're not going to go from this presentation tomorrow and say I am going to become a Bitcoin knots developer or whatever, but like the idea is like the closer you get to, you know, the all the way to the root, the more sovereign you are. Yeah. Awesome. I'm sure you all are tired of hearing my raspy voice. Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Woo! Thank you for being part of this journey.